Now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, coaching, and 360-degree feedback. Dr. Rose personally coaches over 100 leaders per year, including focused post-360 feedback sessions and also more long-term engagements. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he has supported leaders at every level, from board chair to first-line supervisor. In addition to his coaching work, Dr. Rose is a widely published author in academic journals, and his book, Hire Better Teachers Now, was recently released by Harvard Education Press. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Rose.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you all for joining me today. I'm very excited to be presenting some of our results from our 5th study. It's hard to believe now we've been doing this for almost 14 years, looking at current practices in 360 feedback. And so what we'd like to do today is to cover kind of some key insights from the study. There are hundreds and hundreds of data points, of course, in the study across the entire gamut of decisions that leaders make when designing their 360 practices. But we're going to kind of focus on seven real highlights. Now the study, if you haven't seen it before, it was kind of spawned out of the many questions that we often get with our clients when we deliver 360 practices, where they're asking us, well, gee, how do companies usually do X, Y, Z in their process? And we thought, well, we've got our own opinion, we've got our own experiences, but wouldn't it be great to try to get kind of a marketplace view for what current practices actually are? We know there are a lot of books and articles and things about best practices. Certainly advisors have good ideas about best practices, but just being able to contrast what your peer organizations are doing when they're confronted with those very decisions that you're making when you're trying to design a 360 program seems like a useful, valuable resource. And indeed, when we look at the data, we find some pretty interesting things. So today we're going to highlight 7 standout areas that when we looked at the data thought, that's pretty interesting and seemed like a worthwhile topic to cover. So let me just jump right into the data and give you an idea of the kinds of things that we're finding when we look at the results. So the first thing is an interesting kind of shift in the way we're thinking about and looking at 360s, which is that 360s really are used in a variety of different programs. So typically when someone says, well, gee, what's the best practice in 360-degree feedback, there's an assumption there that there is a singular entity of 360 feedback and that it doesn't change very much by context. And what we're starting to see is that, in fact, the data do change a little bit by context, and we're going to see some interesting results in there. We actually are going to be out over the next 6 months or so, various different spotlights on those different features by program. Today we're going to be focusing primarily across program, but it's interesting to note that there were really some pretty standout differences between different program types. So one of the things that we did in our study is we asked people, well, what kinds of programs do you incorporate your 360 into? And we found a pretty wide spectrum. So we've got these 5 different program types that people reported that they used their 360s for. So for example, leadership coaching. Leadership coaching is really thinking about it as a systematic, so if you have a systematic coaching program that you've designed for your organization, do you include 360s in it or not? Some coaching programs will, some coaching programs won't. So in our case, 35% of the companies that we were surveying included their 360 in their leadership coaching program, and they responded accordingly. Another 38% use their 360s within what we call the formal leadership education program. This is basically sort of like that leadership university or academy that an organization might build for their leaders, tailored around their leaders' needs, and it looks like about 38% of organizations are including a 360 in that type of program. The talent review program was really more around sort of system-wide. This would be kind of across all business units across the organization, trying to get talent information for leaders across the system, and then often incorporating that into some kind of succession planning, talent review type process, but then also maybe more some just general leadership development for all leaders. again, kind of across the system. And then, interestingly, the most popular, most commonly used program or program type was really, in a sense, not a program at all, but just more of that kind of ad hoc, hey, let's do a 360, with this group of leads. They really need some feedback, so let's launch a project for them, but not necessarily having quite the system-wide view. Very much kind of non-programmatic and typically requested as needed. And then lastly, the least popular, but still, not uncommon, is using it for performance management. We'll see some interesting data on that. In fact, that was kind of one of our more interesting findings globally, was the notion that if you looked at the way organizations that are using 360s for performance management make some of these decisions, it differed quite a bit from what we called the development-focused program. So basically what we've done, and we'll see some results this way, is we've taken these 4 programs and said, all right, if we look at the decisions organizations make that are doing all of these program types and contrast it to the performance management group, we find some pretty interesting differences, and we'll unveil some of those as we go forward today. So the other interesting thing when we were getting data from these organizations is to see that organizations actually use the data or use the process, use a 360 process in multiple different programs. So it's not just we're only using 360s in coaching. They may be using it in multiple different programs. So one of the things we looked at was, well, how many different program types are you using 360 for? And while a little bit less than half, 45%, were using it just for the one program, more than half were using it for 2 or more, and in 2% of the cases, they actually had 5 different types of programs that they were incorporating a 360 into. So again, this notion that 360 is being used in multiple different formats, multiple different contexts, and when we look at some of the data, we find that the program type actually does dictate some of the kinds of decisions that you're going to make. So we'll get at those in just a bit. So let's see what kinds of program differences we found. And again, many different data points here. I'm trying to just laser focus on a few of the most interesting ones. So when we ask the question, what type of program are you using your 360 for, as I mentioned, we kind of grouped the data separately. And what we found is that when you do a sort of development-focused program, there are some differences there in terms of comparing it to specifically performance management programs. So this is an example. We've been kind of teasing this question out for a long time now. A lot of debate about what kinds of decisions you should make on using a 360. And in general, the debate is around, should you be making development-oriented decisions or more sort of what we might call administrative or personnel decisions. Good friend and colleague of mine, Dave Bracken, has a great blog post called "What is a Decision?" to try to really unpack this. And I think what we've done in doing a smaller version of this is uncovered that when you're using 360s in one of those development-focused programs, you tend to be more tilting in the direction of development-oriented, so the self-development, self-directed development only, or development planning decisions, but likely not personnel decisions, okay? On the other hand, when you're using it in performance management, really the intent there is more for personnel decisions. So the interesting thing for me in this is to recognize that there are different kinds of decisions that you can use a 360 for. So if someone asks, well, is 360 for development or for more personnel decisions, I think the answer really is yes, it's both. But to recognize that you may design the program a little differently if it's being used for one kind of decision than for the other. So that's really, I think, the key insight here is that there are differences. They're very real and tangible, but it's mostly going to end up guiding some decisions that you make about how you, everything from how long the survey is to who gets access to the data are going to change based on which ones of these you're doing. So the other interesting question we asked people was, how much trust do your employees have in the process? One of the big things in 360 feedback, of course, is that they typically it's anonymous, confidential feedback, and so how much trust do people have in that is absolutely essential for the success of the program. And what we found when we took the average here is that a statistically significant increase when you compare the two in terms of the amount of trust that employees have for development-focused programs. So organizations that are using it from a development-focused standpoint tend to believe that their employees trust the process a lot more than people that are doing it for performance management in general. Both of these sort of tilt in the direction of agree, but you can see there's room to grow here, and certainly when you're telling employees this is anonymous, this is confidential, it's employee trust is something to consider. It looks like in particular organizations that are using it for performance management may have even a little bit more room to grow in that area. So another interesting finding was around internal versus external support. The question being, do we run the process ourselves? Do we have someone internal that's collecting the data, reporting the data, using the data, or are we leveraging someone from the outside? And what might be the kind of the better approach there? In particular, when it comes to coaching and things like this, there are sensitivities around confidentiality of the conversation. So if someone's debriefing a leader on their report, how confidential is that conversation? And we're talking to a coach who is an HR leader, for example, and they're in a sense trained to deliver that feedback. How much does that leader, how much does the person getting the trust that HR manager really is just there for their benefit, or is there some after conversation that's going? Is there some subtext to the meeting with this HR person? So there's a case where internal versus external may be important. The other issues have to do with, do you have people who have the skill set to deliver the coaching, or are they really needing to develop that up? And then in some cases we've seen where the internal politics, right? The HR person, not necessarily the best person from a political standpoint in certain situations, so leveraging external support is important there. So the question being, is external, is this a highly externally supported process, or is this a process that can be mostly run internally, and what are the issues there? So what do organizations do? What are some of the choices that they make? What we see in particular when it comes to developing survey content, there tends to be a strong emphasis toward external. There are variations of this. Sometimes there'll be an external consultant that is, in a sense, almost embedded with an internal team, and collectively they develop and create the content for that survey. It could be that they just completely outsource it and say, you tell us what do we need to do, you do the process, you collect the data on what success factors there are for our leaders, and embed that in the tool. And then, of course, a small percentage are just taking off the shelf using some established leadership model, but not necessarily customizing it. When you put that all together, it's a little over, approaching 2/3 that are really leveraging external resources in one way, shape, or form. But there is a pretty significant minority that are just really trying to do this internally. You can see particularly, for example, in the performance management space, that might be more of a typical internal process, in that they're likely leveraging what's already been an internal process in terms of content for the survey. The other one has to do with internal versus external coaches. So this is a question that we get a lot, and there are a lot of kind of ins and outs about whether internal coaches are better versus external coaches. Better or not, it looks like clearly internal is the preferred mode for debriefing those 360s, though it is growing. We've got a pretty significant 15% or so increase in the use of external coaches. And I think that likely has to do, again, with the awareness of the importance of that kind of confidentiality. Also a skill set issue, again, just an individual difference in terms of the organization. Some organizations have a really strong sort of OD and leadership group within HR. Others really don't have that and need to import that expertise. So I think that's likely kind of what's driving this more than anything. And then the next one, again, who's handling the data? So this is a real issue from anonymity and confidentiality perspective, that if an internal group has access to the raw data of who said what, right? Whether Jane rated Bob this way or that way. That's different than if they have access to the report. So who's actually scoring it and who has access to the raw reports is really kind of critical. Again, I think people are seeing that having that housed outside just adds that layer of comfort for employees to know that there's no one inside the organization that has access to it. On the other hand, there are some organizations that do leverage that sort of software-oriented platform and are willing to take that leap and have internal folks do the scoring and whatnot. Just back for just a second. So again, I think that internal-external support, this is one of those design decisions that's a really critical positional thing to think about when you're looking at designing a 360 process. You've really got to kind of, where do we want to put our resources? And is this a process we're going to do every month? Is this a process we're going to do every year? Is it a process we're going to do every other year? And where do we want to put our resources and our expertise in terms of implementing the process, in terms of supporting the process afterwards? And I think really the message we're seeing here is it's a matter of kind of right-sizing it and making sure you've got that external support where you need it, but then leveraging internal support and building capacity internal where you can, but without losing the quality that you need to make sure there's trust in the process. I think that's just a really critical design feature. So thinking about how much of this can be internal, how much of it should be external, and where do we want to make that balance is just a key overarching design decision any organization is going to have to go through. So another interesting one that's sort of the longest standing debate, if you will, and in some of my writings I've been trying to kind of make the case that this debate is sort of long enough standing that we should probably let go of it and recognize there are sort of two camps, and that's fine. But this long-standing debate about is 360 a development tool, or should it be more of an administrative decision-making tool? And again, colleague Dave Bracken on that kind of decision makes, where does it stand? Well, what is a decision? I think the message that we're hearing pretty loud and clear in general, and we'll see some of the data on this, is that 360 is clearly primarily a development tool. In fact, one could argue that it's always a development tool, or should always be a development tool to some component or another. But then the question is it exclusively for development? And that's where we start seeing some differences. And I think the marketplace has kind of spoken very much in the kind of camp of yes and, that we need to use it for development, maybe some other pieces that we can also use it for as well. And in fact, what we'll see is even when you're using it for performance management, kind of the quintessential sort of decision-making or administrative, if you will, sort of decision-making personnel use. Even then, there is still going to be a development component, as any good performance management process should have. So let's see what the data are telling us about how that debate may be resolving itself, again, out in terms of just not just what people are saying, but what they're doing. So we asked kind of how do you use the data? And you can see here we literally stack rank these results from most common to least common. And interestingly, the top 3 most common uses really have some sort of development component. All the ones on the bottom 7, are all much more tilting in that kind of personnel direction. So again, it's not that it's not being used for this wide range, everything from performance management straight away to succession planning to indirect or even direct links to pay or promotion, but those uses just tend to be much less popular. So they're out there, they're being done, but again, develop really is the core. That's kind of the core of what we're seeing. And so we're seeing it very much as a yes and. Even those organizations doing it for performance management are going to also have, they're recognizing the developmental component of getting honest feedback from your direct reports and colleagues around your performance as a leader. That's just got to be a developmental tool, but it may also be some other things. So lots of different uses. When we split the data out, again, looking at, well, what about that development focus? We talked about those 4 development-focused programs versus the performance management programs. You can see here a split, again, where in these, indirect link for promotion, pay increases, all that sort of thing, very rarely are development-focused programs using 360 results for those kinds of, if you could call them, personnel decisions, and much more frequently performance management is processes are using those kinds of personnel decisions. But in both program types where this tool is being used, clearly development generically and specifically career development, stand out as important uses. As expected, a little bit more for development-focused programs, but certainly if you've got 71% of those folks saying they're using 360s for performance management, including development as a use, clearly it's a popular and important usage for the tool. So yeah, I guess the question then, is it this? Is it that? I just would say yes, and people are seeing it as a multiplicable uses. So again, this even goes back to the notion of multiple different program types being used, multiple different decision types being used. So clearly a tool that people are valuing as a really flexible and flexible tool that can be morphed to multiple different purposes. And in fact, when we look at kind of, again, that classical debate and those sort of, there is clearly a camp that continues to have this premise that 360 should really only be for development. But as we see in the data, it's a fairly small group. So less than a quarter, slightly less than a quarter of the organizations really are holding on to this belief that it ought to be only self-directed development decisions. So we tried to get the language really precise here to get people to recognize that we're not talking kind of development versus not development. We're talking the person owns the report, the organization never sees it, it's up to them to self-direct their own development. That tends to be a not particularly a popular usage. It's non-zero, but it certainly is not the norm. Organizations are really, I think, seeing the multiple different ways of using the data. Now, one of the data points that we were interested in having done this, we work with lots of different kinds of organizations that come to us with all range of content points. So, we want to measure this, we want to measure this. One of the core questions is, well, what are we going to measure? What is the content of this instrument going to be? So we were interested in that from the perspective we're seeing a real proliferation of multi-rater and 360 tools in a variety of different arenas. I've seen one recently on sort of self-branding. My current favorite worst question, least favorite, whatever, my current worst question I've ever seen in 360 feedback kind of tees this up well, I think, which is around, the question was, if this person was a dog, what kind of dog would they be? The psychometricians in the world literally skip a beat when they hear that. It's stunning that such a question would be asked. But again, so this question of, well, what is it? Is that really 360? And what is it that we're really asking? What is the content? Interestingly, when we looked at the data, we found that clearly behaviors stood out as the standard or the most common approach to using 360s from a content standpoint. So the content, though, is clearly not personality. So literally not a single company reported using 360s to measure personality. I am sure that there is somebody out there doing it somewhere, but I was heartened to see that no companies are using the tool that way. And so when we talk about personality, we have to recognize personality is very much not observable, right? It's an internal process. It's what's going on. The behaviors that you exhibit that may be derived from your personality in some way, shape, or form, or influenced by your personality are observable, but to observe someone's personality from the outside, very challenging. So when you look at something like conscientious, extroverted, excitable, these are kind of dimensions of personality that a true self-report personality can reliably measure using a variety of different spectrums of content and items and methodologies, but they're all self-report. They're all what's going on sort of inside your head and not external. So when we talk about behaviors, we're talking about things like follows through on commitments. So yes, someone who has a personality that has been measured through a reliable and valid tool on personality to have a high level of conscientiousness may also exhibit a behavior of follows through on commitments, but I certainly wouldn't want one of my peers or my direct reports to judge my conscientiousness globally. I would much prefer them to observe what they observe in my behaviors, and then I can make my own inferences about what's going on in my own head. So from a measurement standpoint, very encouraged that the kind of best practices kind of has emerged in the marketplace to focus on behaviors. So just to kind of flesh that out a little bit, let me give you some examples. So if we look at a kind of a classic personality test, or certainly commonly used one that looks at some dimensions, kind of the dark side dimensions of personality, you might look at excitable, right? So the talking about the concern being overly enthusiastic about people or projects. Well, you might be able to observe that, and then becoming disappointed with them. Well, that's very much an internal process, as personality is, right? So your own, are you excited? Are you enthusiastic? And then are you disappointed? Well, I don't know. I know what your behavior is and what I see, but I don't really know what your internal process is. So measuring this from others on the outside, very challenging to do accurately, reliably. A lot of concerns for a measure that was trying to do that. On the other hand, if we look at, and this is actually one of our tools, the Leadership Navigator, you look at some of the behaviors embedded in there, proactively addresses issues before they become problems. I can see that happen. I can see whether someone's addressing those issues or not. Conveys a sense of urgency when necessary. I can see that. There's some contextual external variables around when is it necessary, when is it not, right? But it's about your behavior externally. It's not your own internal experience of that behavior. It's not, cares about the important things. Well, I don't know if you care or not. I know if you have a sense of urgency because I see you out there doing that and pushing the envelope and following up and that kind of thing. So really trying to measure behavior is what the marketplace has kind of landed on in terms of what people and organizations are trying to do with their 360s, and I think that's encouraging, and certainly was one of the nicer findings that we got in terms of literally 0% of the companies out there doing behaviors. I'm sure there's one, but we just didn't find them. Okay, another interesting one. So there's a lot of focus in 360s on kind of what I think of as kind of collecting data, reporting data, right? It's a very complicated process. It takes a real effort, especially if you're doing it broadly. A lot of people get touch points across the organization, and so there can be a lot of emphasis on how do we collect the data, what surveys are we doing, what is the report going to look like. But then there's the question of what you do with it, and I think there's a debate with 360 practitioners of, is the real value of the process in how the data are collected and what the report looks like, what the content is, or does the process in a sense kind of begin when that report arrives? One of the phrases that we've used is this notion of the desk drop, right? So if you just collect the data and then drop the report on someone's desk, have you done 360? Is that enough? We would argue that really 360 is about change, and so giving somebody a report is not helping them to change, and you probably need to do something afterward to get them moving, and we've written extensively on kind of what those kind of key metrics are in terms of drivers for change. But one of the ones that comes up frequently when you're designing a program is, are we going to give someone a coach? Are we going to give someone to talk to about that report to try to make sense of it? So you can call these coaching debriefs, right? So are coaching debriefs, key ingredient, or are they icing on the cake? Is it kind of optional and maybe we're going to have someone meet with them and maybe we aren't? What's the value there, and where are people landing in terms of, are they including some kind of follow-up coaching? It may not be a 6-month thing. We're focusing on a debrief, probably an hour, to kind of go through and make sense of it and then come up with some actions. Turns out that just about 2/3 of the organizations are including, seeing those 360 debriefs as essential in the process. So that's kind of critical. And I think if we included, highly important, the number jumps up to like 90% or something. But 61% see it as essential. That is a non-optional part of the process, is having someone work with you to kind of make sense of not just the data, but really how do these data fit into your context and what can you do with them moving forward. If you just get that desk drop, well, okay, I can use it, I cannot, I'm busy. But if you're going to meet with someone and they're going to help you focus in on a few areas, organizations are seeing that as actually an essential part of the process. And when we look further at, well, how many of them are actually doing it? It's one thing to say it's essential, but are they following following through on that opinion with budget and resources and time, that becomes another question. One of the exciting findings for us is that the answer there is a fairly stable one when we look back, over the 14 years we've done this. So when we ask what support is available, there's a variety of different support components here. Happy to see the managers included. But in particular, you can see here that just about 2/3 of the organizations consistently for the last 14 years or so have been seeing and using this debrief as an essential part of the program. So I think it's and again, encouraging. I'd like to see that move up even further. We've certainly seen just that the ROI, the effect of the program goes way up when you actually have someone follow up. Parenthetically, we host a variety of different forums and whatnot, and we're earlier in the year meeting with a group of organizations talking about their current practices and sharing those best practices. We heard from one of those organizations saying that they had really much more of a desktop approach. They were trying to get it out to as many different people as they could, so they put all their resources on data collection, reporting, making sure as many people could get the feedback as possible. When they went back and looked at their statistics, they found that 27% of the people who participated in the process never even opened their report. So again, that question of where are your resources, if you're doing a coaching debrief, clearly you're making sure that each one of those people is looking at the data, working with the data, and trying to take action on it. So very encouraged these findings. I think one of our more stable findings over time. You can see there are a variety of other different uses in terms of ways people are trying to get follow-up going. I think one of the things that we see here is that individual contact is critical. So you can see the coaching and the manager, those are really, really essential. Trying to diversify and spread out those resources a little bit, you can do kind of a workshop, group workshop, but not nearly as impactful as that one-on-one piece. So again, very encouraged that organizations are tending to kind of follow some of those best practices. All right, let's take a look at our last and perhaps most interesting in some respects is, people constantly, is 360, sort of a trend? Is it something that's, kind of a fad of the day? Is it coming? Is it going? That kind of. So one of the things we did is wanted to check in with people on, well, what kind of support do you see for 360s in the organization? There's all kinds of other feedback mechanisms you can use, and I think 360 is a particularly unique one in that it's a much more systematic look at your feedback with some planning embedded. It's not just ping, ping, oh, you did great on that, you did great on that, like. That's very light, kind of, I don't need to process it, I don't need to plan, it's not embedded in my career planning at all. So 360s, I think, are really showing up as a different form of feedback in that they're much more methodical and carefully thought through. You put more resources into them because they tend to be used to guide lots of kinds of decisions that can affect careers, that can affect your growth, can affect a lot of things in terms of your effectiveness. And doing that carefully and thoughtfully makes a lot of sense. But again, as I say, there's a lot of kind of light touch, sort of fluff kinds of feedback out there. We called them in a recent article alternate forms of feedback, not necessarily to represent just fluff, but alternate forms of feedback that come in a lot of variety of ways. So is 360 gaining in popularity or waning in popularity? When we asked organizations, again, this notion of, do you see doing more or less of this? We say 4 out of 5 dentists, right? 4 out of 5 HR leaders feel they will be doing the same or more of these. And this has been this confidence in the use of 360s continuing and or doing more of them has been a pretty consistent finding over the years. So I'm really certainly encouraged to see that there are many organizations that see the value in the process and intend to do more. And that they see senior support. Anybody knows that a program like this, or any program, but particularly a 360 program where you're touching on high-level leaders often, although we do see it going all the way down to individual contributors and running through an organization, but particularly any organization that's going to impact leaders, you want senior leadership to be supporting because they're the ones that are really going to be driving the train in terms of endorsing and pushing and helping those leaders to grow and be more effective. So really encouraged that HR leaders are seeing a lot of support from their senior leaders, and very few, if we slice it all the way down, very few see almost no support. So again, strong support, continued use, encouraging, a lot of practices that we see organizations doing. I will say there are a ton of, when we tried to get through and which 7 are we going to highlight and which ones do we cover, the number of data points are immense. So I do recommend that you go and you look at it. You can parse some of the data that I've presented here today. But there are a bunch of other data points in the report. And again, the report is organized, and the analysis that we do is organized with the HR leader in mind that's going to be designing a 360 process. So it really walks through all the decisions that one is going to make in designing a program, and helps you to evaluate either, hey, how do we stack up to, in terms of what we're doing in our current program, to what other people are doing on each of these different elements. Or if you're starting out new, it sometimes even just the questions of have you thought of this design element can be really valuable. So I hope you found that useful. I know that Jesse wanted to cover a couple of other things on the study and kind of what's coming next with it. So let me turn it over to you, Jesse, and you can give us a couple of more factoids before we move on to some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dale. So first of all, I wanted to let all of you know, for those of you who haven't already gotten your copy of the study, we're going to be sending it out as a follow-up to the webinar. Just one quick note for you, the electronic copy actually isn't printable, but you can get a printed copy on Amazon. And if you have friends and colleagues that you think would like a copy of the study, you can have them email us at research@3dgroup.net. The other news is, as we mentioned, this is the first in a series of webinars. Dale previewed this webinar well. We're going to be doing our next one on performance management versus development-focused 360s. And as you know, this is a hotly debated topic in the field, whether or not performance management 360s makes sense. So we'll be digging deeper into that on October 6th, and we hope you'll join us. So now for a few questions. This one actually is sort of a preview into our next webinar. We had someone mention that they thought that 360s were for development and using them for performance management was problematic. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what you think about that issue.
Yeah, so again, there's been lots out there. I think there's almost kind of a dogmatic sort of position, if you will, about it's only for development. But I think what we've seen is that organizations recognize the multiple different kinds of decisions that these tools can use or can be used for. And so I would say that you can, and we do performance management related programs. We've got some clients that do 360s as a clear feed right into their performance management. Probably the most effective approach I've seen is using it as kind of a parallel. And in fact, I think Pepsi's got a really great article on this about how they sort of have a performance management 360 and then a development 360 that are staggered in time. And I think that's a really good way to kind of use the tool in both different facets. I do think there are some impacts in terms of process, and you have to really think through the two differently and position them differently. Even something as simple, and I'm kind of previewing some of the data that I know for our next one around something like survey length. So we found in our previous study that survey length was sort of shrinking. Well, when we looked at the current data, we realized that may be a moderator, that it's actually that when you're using it for performance management, it tends to be shorter surveys, but development surveys tend to be a little bit longer and more rich, which would kind of make sense. So I guess what I would say is the most important thing is that you're really clear with your audience, you're really clear with employees, that you communicate, you're transparent about where the data is going, how it's being used, and that if you're designing with the end in mind, you certainly can use 360s well for performance management and a variety of other personnel-related decisions, but just do so cautiously and transparently.
Okay, we're having some more questions coming in right now, which is great. Patricia would like to know, could you clarify what the difference is between development and career development?
Hello, Patricia. How's Milwaukee today? Yeah, so let's see. I guess I would think about development being maybe more broad, and it could be more specific. Broad and more specific. Could be broader in the sense that you could cover more topics, right? So it might be, working with a leader on giving them kind of a broad set of, as a leader, what are these various issues that, let's look at you as a leader and how effective you are. And by using that broader set, you might zero in on, oh, look, delegation is critical for you right now. You've got new employees coming in. Let's look at how you can be effective in delegation specifically. So that might be kind of, casting the net wider. Career development is more, I would see it more as a use that HR might have, or that you could use. Actually, I was talking with a client earlier this week that was saying, one of the great things about the 360 is we get leaders all the time where they're saying, I'm great, I should get a promotion, I should be at that next level. Actually, particularly with millennials and early career folks. And so from a career development standpoint, you can be using it to kind of say, hey, look, here are the gaps, and you need to really move these up in the context of getting you to that next level, if you will, in your career. So I guess I would see that as a more specific conversation targeted toward career growth. Often we'll do coaching with someone who's in a transition. They're either pre-promotion or just promoted. So again, let's do a 360 to find out how you're landing, or to check in on what gaps you might have for that promotion, versus let's do a 360 to develop our people on a particular topic. We have actually a seminar coming up on an organization that used 360s across the top 3 layers of their organization to specifically zero in on how well their leaders were developing talent below them. It was a very focused question, and that's a development-oriented thing. They're trying to develop all their leaders on that particular issue of how well they develop their own teams. And that would be development-oriented, but not really career-related. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. So Geraldine asked, have you had any involvement in the 360 concept for hiring, like crowdsourcing reference checks?
Yeah, not seen that work. It's a little tricky when you're thinking 360s for hiring, and I would differentiate, and our article kind of defines 360 in a way that I think would differentiate crowdsourcing from 360. Typically, I think of 360 almost like an opportunity to measure a leader's effectiveness within their kind of immediate social system, and you want to be able to define that system of focus. So maybe I'm interested really mostly in direct reports or direct reports and peers, and that's the group that I'm going to contain the feedback to, and I'm going to do that intentionally because I'm interested in that population and the effect on that population. A crowdsourced approach might be a lot more kind of, catch as catch can. You might not be as clear that the data are representing the most important groups. It may be a little bit more, spontaneous about whether people are included or not. So from a hiring standpoint, that specific sphere is really difficult to get unless it's internal. So I have seen 360s very frequently used as internal tools for promotion or decisions, so that version of selection, but less so. I would be very concerned about using them for selection just because, again, you don't have as much control over, how valid and reliable are these data really. And, of course, those are pretty key things when it comes to hiring. But give me a call, Geraldine, because I would love to know what you've seen in that. It sounds suspect to me, but yeah.
Okay, so our last question is, Gail, what are your thoughts about the organization rather than the individual choosing who provides the feedback?
Yeah, selecting raters. So generally, we've seen and we've got cases in the data where companies actually don't even give the report to the individual, which I don't completely get. But So generally what I would say is you want the person getting the feedback to have some involvement in selecting the people providing the feedback. I can't tell you how many leaders, when we've gone the other way, where the organization just says, org chart, we've got it, let's make it easier, we'll just do all their direct reports, their boss, and this group of peers as the org chart indicates. I can't tell you how many people get that feedback and then they're looking for some excuse and to dismiss it, and they look at it and they say, oh yeah, these are just the wrong people. And you just sit there and you, as a coach debriefing that person, it's pretty hard to work with that because they've come up with a perfect defense mechanism. So what I would say, and what we typically see, and I believe the data support this, if you look in the report itself, there are some data points there on how raters are selected. I believe that the best practice, and I believe the most common practice, is for people to select the raters themselves and give the organization, in the form of either an HR leader or their manager, preferably from my perspective the manager, to approve those raters so that there's some accountability. You didn't pick the friends and family plan, but also importantly there's someone else involved in the process early on so that when the feedback are available, then the manager hopefully is, hey, how did that feedback go when you asked all those people that I saw you were going to be asking feedback? And now you've got the manager involved, and that's really where you want to be from a development standpoint. So best practice, and I believe most current practice, but again I'd have to dive into the study.
Yes, it is.
Select self and then let the manager or an HR person approve. But I'd be pretty cautious about just, here, we've chosen for you. It just gives them an excuse to get out of doing any kind of real change.
Okay, great. So the last question we had was just, will we be sending out an invite for the October 6th webinar? Absolutely. Thank you for that question. It looks like those are all the questions we have for today. If you have questions that we didn't address, please feel free to reach out to us at 510-463-0333 and visit our website. Thank you all again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much.